So for those of you who haven't taken one of my classes, my name is Thomas Wilburn. I'm an instructor here. I teach JavaScript and sometimes advanced web development. For my day job, I am a web developer for ArenaNet in Bellevue. Before that, I was at Big Fish. Before that, I was actually a journalist. I wasn't a web developer at all. But at Big Fish, we started working on a project called Big Fish Unlimited. And it was a chance in the organization to use a lot of these new generation of tools that we have available to us now as web developers. I think a lot of people are really familiar with a workflow that's basically, I'll write something in Notepad or a simple text editor, and then I will load it in the browser, and I'll hit refresh, and I'm done, right? Like, that's part of the joy of being a web developer, is that things are that simple. But these days, there's been a lot of entry, and certainly in the last 5 years, definitely in the last 2, there's been a lot of uptake of tools that allow us as web developers to get around the things that are less efficient about our jobs. And Lord knows there are plenty of them. One of those things is CSS. If anyone here has maintained a site that is sufficiently large for any amount of time, your CSS eventually turns into this huge, grotesque monster. Right? It becomes, you want to serve as few files as possible, so you're trying to keep it to as few huge files, so there's a lot to scroll through. You have to manage all these different nested classes and selectors, try and make it maintainable as your site grows. It's very, very difficult, particularly if you're trying to do any kind of branding or redesign. Having to go back through all that CSS is a nightmare. And Less is intended as a tool that tries to solve that problem. So one of the cool things about Less that I want to start with, so I've created a simple web app here. It's just a dummy. It doesn't actually work. It is a peer review for a team. So you would go through and you would fill this out with your coworkers. Do they work well together? Do they complete their work on time? Have they completed their year's goals? All of those kinds of things. Fill it out, hit save. And what I want to do is demonstrate using this the way that we can take an already existing CSS file. So this is not just for new projects. It's actually one of the nice things about Less. So I've gone through and I've taken my CSS file and I've saved it as a Less file, right? Now it's demo.less. And I'm just going to go here. I'm going to change this to style sheet less, and I'm going to change the file name. And I'm going to refresh the page. And it still works, right? Less is more than CSS, but regular CSS is a subset. So you can take your existing CSS, feed it to Less, and you get back the same file, which is great. It means that you don't have to start from scratch. You can start adding this where it makes sense. So now that we've got that, what are some of the things that it does, right? I've been talking about how it makes things easier. Well, one of the things it makes easier is to get this running, we changed the rel of the style sheet, and we changed the way that it linked. And we also included this script file in the head underneath the link tag. And you can get this from the Less homepage, which I probably should have started with, lesscss.org. And when we load this up, there's a download Less, and it's got all the language reference. It's a great page, right? All the stuff that you could possibly need about this language. Good tutorials. So you get this JavaScript file, and you include it. And what it's doing is it's reading in this file and converting it in real time. Not only is it doing that, but if we add a little hash exclamation point watch to the end, then it's actually going to watch that file. So we talk about, as web developers, having the save and refresh cycle. No, we don't have that anymore. We just have save. So if I go through and I decide that I want all of my fonts to be 48 pixels high because I can't see anything, I save the file, and it's going to check back every like 5-10 seconds. It's going to check to see if that file has changed, recompile it if it has. This works on a server if you're running your own Apache instance, but I'm just running it on the file system. I don't have to do anything special to get this up and running. I just include the script tag and my Less file. So if nothing else, this is already pretty great. I mean, I gotta say, like, this is already one of my favorite things about this. But what do we want to do next? So let's solve a really simple problem. Let's say that the organization that we're working for that has this web app has changed its branding. So they've decided to change the colors for the organization. And that means that we need to change the colors for all of our internal stuff to match the logos, because heaven forbid that you use something with last year's colors in it. Now, normally in CSS, remember, there aren't any variables. And so if we need to change colors on something, in all the little variations of color that we might have, we have to go through and search replace and hope that we've caught all of them. Make sure that we weren't case sensitive or something. So in this case, I've got, it's mostly grays. This was pretty boring. We're going to jazz it up a little bit. One of the things that I can do here is less gives us variables. I can declare a variable by saying @ and then saying the variable name. Let's go ahead, let's say, we're going to brand this, so let's give it a primary color. And that color is, I want to make sure I've got the syntax right. It's going to be really embarrassing if I'm showing you this and it turns out that it's not right. That's what I thought. Okay, cool. So we'll say primary, and let's make our primary color kind of like a nice blue. So we'll go with 789. Now I've defined that, but I haven't placed it anywhere, right? Let's start changing things so that they match our primary color. So let's say that like our selected tabs should have that color. Okay, cool. Let's come up with a secondary color that's maybe a little bit faded. So we'll do secondary. Our secondary brand color is really more of a mint chip green, I think. So let's go with like a 9E9. And let's make that our regular tab color. There we go. Cool. And so now what I'm able to do is later on, I can use these primary and secondary colors, right? I can say that all of my panels, the panel sections here, they're all in secondary. So they're all in that nice mint chip green. And if my organization changes its colors later, I only have to change them in one place. I've referred to my brand colors in different places, and that's the only place that I have to actually change them to redefine them through my entire less file. So this is already going to save me a lot of time when it comes to having to refactor this website. Now the next thing that I want to do is there are probably a lot of places where I have I probably have kind of UI considerations that are common. For example, my house style of UI might include that all inputs should have a certain look and feel. I haven't styled these inputs at all. Let's go ahead and add a section here. So let's say that input and text area, these guys should all look like, let's see. Let's give them a margin that's nothing from the top, but 1 EM on each side. Give them a dotted border. All right, so I'm already mixing these in. There we go. I like to give them a little border radius myself because I think that looks snazzy. So let's say 4px, that'll work. All right, so this is my house style for inputs, right? All of my inputs should look like this. But it turns out that these are the kinds of styles that I probably want across a lot of things. Like once I have inputs that look like this, I may need to style other elements that aren't inputs, such as like a jQuery UI dropdown. I'm going to want it to look like that so that it matches the style. So the next thing that we can do using less is we can write what's called a mixin. Now a mixin just looks like a class. So let's call this fancy input. And I'm going to take these styles and I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to move them over here into fancy input. And then I'm just going to add that as though I were adding a class. I'm going to say fancy input there at the end. What this does is it tells less all of these things that are in this kind of like class that I've defined. I want you to include them here as though they were part of that style. So now I can go and I can change this. I don't really like them having just that margin. Let's give them a little bit on each side. There we go. So now they stand out a little bit. So I can now add that mix in to other things, right? I can share those. Now there are a lot of cases where I don't know if this is necessarily like whether or not you want a fancy input. That's getting pretty granular. But I might, for example, have a house style of how rounded things are, or what colors and shadings and text shadows. You know, one of the things that I might have, there might be a standard shadow that I want to use for my text. And so I might define that as text shadow is 1px, 1px. Let's give it a little bit of blur, and then let's make it an RGBA 23. So now anything that I want to have a shadow, I can add that to it so that when I type in here, let's give it a box shadow too so that it really stands out. Box shadow. Right? Anything that I give that shadow appearance to, they'll always be consistent. It's another case where, just as with defining variables, I can basically define kind of like mix-in classes that are going to keep things consistent throughout my entire design. And if I change the way that shadows are, if I look at this and I'm like, man, there's like really dark shadows are really hideous, they're really messing up my groove here, I can go through and I can change those in one place. And anything that uses those shadows will be able to pull that in across my entire organization, across my entire brand. So mix-ins are great. But what if I decide for certain mix-ins, like let's say that I made a rounded, and I wanted to support really old browsers. So I might want to support something that doesn't necessarily have box shadow off the, or text shadow off the bat. So I'm going to say, okay, so Mozilla text shadow is 4px, 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 black. No, border radius. I'm sorry, not text shadow. Moz border radius is 4px, not mox. There we go. And WebKit. And then just regular border radius. I don't think there's a Microsoft syntax for that. Maybe there is. I don't know. Whatever. Let's add it. Why not? Opera. Anybody here use Opera? You should be ashamed of yourself.
Okay.
You're a bad person and you should feel bad. No, I'm kidding. But you're making my life difficult. So now what we've got is we've got this thing where it's rounded. And so it's great. This writes all of our browser-specific CSS for it if we include it, right? If I go through and I replace fancy input and I just say that, so now they've all got a real gentle rounding to them, and that's great. You know, I'm a fan. But there are lots of places where I want to be able to use border radius in a browser-agnostic way. But I also want to be able to specify. I don't always want it to be 4px. Maybe I want it to be so that I'm forming a circle, so I want to use a really big one, or maybe I want something really subtle. So what we can do is we can use what's called a parametric mix-in. And for those of you who have done some programming, it's just a function, basically. I can say rounded takes an argument of radius. And so then, when I go through and I call this, instead of just saying it like this, I pass in that 4 pixels. Let's actually make sure that we can see it. So 12, right? So now it set all of those for me. All of those different radiuses, it just filled them in. And I can set, if I want, a default. I can make it so that if I don't provide one, it defaults to 4 by setting it the way I would any other variable. But now if I really, I'm just like crazy, let's crank up the radius. Why not? I can specify 36. I can have big bubble inputs, and no one can stop me, right? So these kinds of parametric mix-ins where you can define this, you can actually define more than one, because maybe all of my rounded should also have an inset box shadow. And so maybe I want to set the size of my box shadow like this. So I can provide as many parameters as I want to this mix-in, and it will then fill those in for me when it generates the CSS. A really, really powerful tool. Again, the goal of a lot of this is to make sure that I don't have to repeat myself. Those of you guys who are developers should know, anytime you see yourself repeating yourself, if you are copying and pasting, that's a bug, right? That's a mistake. It's a code smell. You should never have to repeat yourself, because the computer is really good at repeating itself. You shouldn't have to do that work. That's why we invented the computer. So less is all about taking those places in CSS where you had to go through and write the same thing over and over again, and taking those away from you so that you can get onto the really hard work of making sure that this actually works in all browsers, right? That's the hard part. We don't, yeah.
Curiosity, it looks fabulous, by the way. I love it already.
Okay.
Well, one thing I was wondering about is how do you troubleshoot Firebug when you've got this complex?
Sure. So Bill's asking how I can see what's generated, and we'll get to how we could actually generate this on our own too. But if we look in the head, so we put a link here, and then we have our script tag, and what less does is it adds a style tag. And that style tag, let me pop this out so we can really see it. That style tag will contain the generated text. So you can actually see here, if I can zoom in, which I don't know if I can. Oh, I can, cool. You can actually see where it's generating all of those different border radius, and it's combining them with the box shadow that I had set up. So if I need to go through and check, now what less will also do is it keeps a log of each time that it's going through and checking the file. If I go through and make a mistake, if I leave out a parentheses, for example, when it goes to watch that file, assuming that I saved it, I don't know. It will normally throw an error. It is not right now. But it usually, when it's watching the file, and it may not do that if it's, I know it will generate errors if the file moves, so if you have any connectivity issues. But usually this is enough. Like usually you can look at the CSS, and in the style tag up here, oh, here we go. We've got a style error message. And so it will actually, I think it actually even displays it here on page. Let's take a look. Yeah, there we go. So it'll actually tell us .round.shadow is undefined, and it'll tell us our line and our column and show us the context. So it's a great tool for actually letting us know that, oh, we misspelled rounded, there we go, and then that less error will vanish. So you've got live feedback the entire time that you're using this watch. All right, this is cool, right? All right, next thing that's really important. So if we take a look here, let's, I'm going to pull up again my Firebug. Let's look at my DOM. So inside here I've got a container, and then inside my container I've got some tabs, and I've got some panels. And so then inside panels I've got each panel and then a panel section, and then I've got whatever goes inside that panel section, right? So when we write CSS, most of the time we end up having to write a lot of really long selectors to handle those kinds of nested cases, right? So for example, if I've got something in my tabs, right, I might have tabs UL, and I've got tabs LI, and I've got tabs LI selected, and I keep having to repeat myself again, right? It's that same problem that I'm having. So one of the things that I really like about less is it lets you actually nest your styles. So let's take this. Let's grab these guys, indent them, move them down a little bit, and then let's take this place where we're in .tabs, and let's just wrap it around as though they were contained inside that style. So we'll just move them inside here. Cool. So now, and we can get rid of you because you're already stated, and we can get rid of you because you're already stated. So once we've nested it, it will actually write those selectors for us. Let's go take a look at what that looks like. So in our style, it's gone through and it's pulled out each of those where I had it nested, and it turns it into its full selector form, .tabs UL, .tabs LI. It will fill that out for me. It'll even do it if I were to put like a comma, like maybe that's also true for menus. So I might add tabs, comma, .menu, and then it will actually build that correctly in the style sheet. We will see once it refreshes. Oh, I don't think I have anything in menu. Did I save it? It should go through and pull that out. I think if there's anything that actually relies on it, it'll go through and it'll build that style for me. Now I've got another case here where I've got two things where, again, I'm repeating myself, right? So if I'm nesting things in order to make them usable, that's already helpful that I've got. Let's put that back. Okay. Let's go through and let's add, we want to nest something like here. I don't want to repeat this list item, right? I don't want to have to say necessarily that it's a separate thing, because I might have lots of stuff that I want to apply to list items, and it's nice if they're grouped together. Yeah?
You put the nested styles into a variable and call that later like you were doing with individual styles before?
I could do things where if I wanted this to be like .rounded, I could do that. Or what do you mean if I wanted to put them into a nested?
Like everything, so .tabs now has the UL, the LI, all that. I then turn everything within that .tabs into a variable that then gets called.
No. No, so your functions have to be a flat list. Okay. They can't be necessarily a nested list, because there's a difference between a mix-in and a nested selector. Okay. So I can combine functions with this, but I can't actually turn this into a function. In general, that doesn't usually come up. Like, it's not a big deal. So I could add something else to this. I could make it so that inside of tabs, if I have like a horizontal rule that has, and this can be anything that I want. You know, if I have a special div inside here that gets background yellow, right? I can add that, and that'll come through, and we'll see that show up. But one of the things that I might want to do is, in this case, I want to organize all of my list item styles in one place. So I can take these, I'm going to cut them out, and I'm going to move them inside of this LI. And instead of where I had the LI before, I'm going to change this to an ampersand. So this means use the outer selector, but make it so that I repeat it here. This gets applied. One of the places where you might use this is for things like your hover or your different interaction, your pseudo classes. I could say when I hover, I want this particular item to, I don't know, let's turn the background a funny color. Background red. So this will go through, it'll build that now, and so now tabs that are hovered will get that. But it was all organized in such a way that I was able to write this without having to keep in mind all of the intervening selectors. I just said within this certain area on the page that I expressed in a very natural way, I want these particular things. You can actually do some really cool stuff with this. One of the things you can do is, along with pseudo classes and properties, one of the things that's valid inside of a nested selector is a media query. So for example, these things right now are tabs, but on a touch device that's sufficiently small, I might not want to use tabs. I might want a menu that's stacked one at a time. So I can write a media query where if the max width is 500px, so if I'm in a very small screen, then in that case I want the, and let's see, display inline, or let's make them display block. So now when I drag my window down, you'll see they changed to block. My media query was written right in there for me, so that I could restrict. You know, a lot of times when we write media queries, one of the things that we end up doing, when I organize them, I end up setting up basically a whole section for all of my tablet styles. And if you're working with a grid, that may still make sense, right? I've got a section for tablet, I've got a section for phone, and I separate those out. But if you have special cases, something like this where it's not expressed by your grid system, where it's something that only happens on that particular size of screen, you don't necessarily want to clutter up your media section that has to do with your grid with all of that extra information. Instead, what makes sense is to restrict that media query right here so that it's really obvious what this media query applies to and where it breaks. And remember, I can use variables inside all of this. So I might have my phone breakpoint. Let's make it camel case. I might make that 500px. And so then later on, if I start working with a high DPI device, or if something changes, or if people finally fix the incredible disaster that is all of this kind of like resolution independence on the web, I can just change my breakpoint in one place. I can change all my media queries. Even if I split my media queries throughout my files, I can change them throughout my entire CSS file just by changing them in one place using a variable. That's pretty sweet. Okay. If you guys will excuse me just a second, I had a list of things I wanted to talk about, and I remember it up to this point, and then it's a total blur to me. So
there are a couple of more seats back there.
Yeah, if people want to head in, and just feel free while I'm kind of reorganizing myself. Okay. So far we've been working in one file. But one of the problems that we've run into with CSS is that you want your stuff to be packaged into one file, but you don't necessarily want to, oh no, that's fine. You don't necessarily want to have to work in that one file, right? Working in one huge file, trust me, I have a CSS file at ArenaNet that is something like 8,000 lines long. Like, it is ridiculous. It is enormous, and it's basically unworkable. In order to find anything in the document, you have to search through. It's not well organized because you can't organize anything at that scale, right? If you think you've started a section somewhere, chances are somebody else will just start that section somewhere else, and now you have styles for the same element in two places. So it's a bad idea. We want to be able to split our files into multiple pieces. So one of the things that lets us do is there's this thing that's actually in, I think, CSS2 called import, right? Import's a really bad idea in your regular CSS files. And the reason for that is because CSS that uses import gets downloaded sequentially. So your performance will be killed because every time, what it's basically doing is it loads that file. Then it has to load it completely before it can read the import, find the next file and load it. If you have multiple dependencies, like files that import other files, now you've basically stacked those. It kills your browser performance. So you don't want to use this in live CSS. But unless we can actually just write this. So let's, for example, let's start a new file. And let's save this as colors.less. Because I'd really like to be able to keep all of my color information in one place. So I'm going to take out my primary and my secondary, and I'm going to move them over here into colors.less. And then here, I'm going to say import colors. And now I can go through and I can change them here. If maybe I think that that green's a little bit eye-popping, actually, and especially on the projector. That's gruesome. Let's soften that up a little bit. So I can save that file. This file will be imported by the less script and built into the file. Now I can organize things. I might have all of my grid classes from my flexible, fluid, responsive framework. I don't want to mix that in with all this other stuff. I want to be able to tweak that separately. I might create a media queries or a responsive.less. You can also import regular CSS this way. With less, you don't have to specify the extension, but if you want to bring in a CSS, you're welcome to, and less will watch that too. So again, this works with your entire workflow, right? You don't necessarily have to start from scratch to find this to be an incredibly useful thing. Yeah?
When you're importing CSS files, does it change the script so that it's not a regular item? So with less, it doesn't have the same kind of
Well, so the speed will be affected while we're building it live. What I'm going to show you guys at the end is you don't want, obviously, this in production. You don't want to get JavaScript involved in building your CSS because that's going to suffer from the same problems. But what we can do is we can then take these less files that we're saving and build them for production into one file. And that'll make things a lot easier for us. That way we get really nice responsive development time. But in production, we have one file, and it downloads super fast, and it's easy to work with, and we don't care how readable it is anymore at that point. Okay. So import, again, this is a great way to start splitting things up. In a lot of cases, when I'm working with, you know, especially if you start working with things like sprite sheets, like if you're embedding sprites into your CSS using Base64. I don't know if any of you guys have done this. For small files, it's really nice because it means that it's not an extra network request. I just finished doing this on my website. But what it means is that in your CSS source, which I'll try and zoom up here for you. Here we go. In your CSS source, you end up with one line that's that. This is a pretty small file. This is like a 4K file, but hey, that's really something I wanted to see. So the other nice thing about less is that if I had organized that into a separate import, I could still have those CSS sprites that are base64 encoded. They're super fast. They don't require an extra connection to my server, but they're also kind of quarantined away from all the CSS that I care about reading, so that all that messiness is hidden and organized in a separate file, and can even be machine generated if I wanted to. I might write a PHP script that takes all of my JPEG files and loads them into the CSS for me, and then just import that with less, so that when I change my graphics, it updates my CSS file automatically. All right, so imports are a really great organizational tool for making sure that we can organize these files the way that we want. So let's go ahead. This is actually going really quickly. Does anyone have any questions, by the way, on what I've done so far before I get to the compilation stuff? Because this is going to get nerdy in a hurry, as if it's not already, frankly.
I'm waiting for the compilation stuff, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
That's what seems boring.
Awesome. Well, let's...
Doing mix-ins if you have a conflict, but...
So mix-ins are basically constants,
Sure.
but they are defined with scope. And so, for example, within tabs, I might have a couple of colors defined. Like I might redefine primary to be a really hideous yellow, I think, is what that'll be. And so what it'll do is that will change inside of tabs, but outside of tabs, primary doesn't change. So I'm also able to override these variables in a local scope instead of necessarily, if one place I want to keep the kind of primary and secondary scheme, but I don't necessarily want to, I don't want to ruin the rest of my file, I can use the same variable names, but I can override them inside that section. But that actually brings up something, so there's something I forgot about, which is, what if I want to work with a color, but I want to just change it a little bit, right? Like variables are really great for when I'm working with color constants. But in a lot of cases, like let's say that I'm doing a really nice splashy button design. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to take these buttons, and I'm like, oh man, buttons. What can you do with buttons? So let's go through. I want to do kind of like Metro style buttons. So I want them to be, they're going to have background of primary, and then let's get that, like shadow on them is awful, so let's do border none. There we go, but they're awfully small now, so let's give them some padding of like 4px and 12px. That's better. Okay, so now one of the things that I'd really like to do is I'd like to give the text a treatment where, or the border a treatment where it is close to the button color, but it is not quite the button color. For example, I might want it to be darker or lighter. If I were just to introduce new variables for that, now what I've got is like a variable explosion, right? I have to come up with a million variables for all these colors, and I have to manage them. Whereas in a lot of cases, it might just be something really simple to transform. And what less does is it gives us some built-in functions that we can use for that. So for example, I might say that I want to lighten the primary color by 10%. And, oh, I guess I need a size for my border, don't I? Let's make it really huge. So like 20px, this is going to be awful, solid. There we go. So I've got a border now that is solid and it's lighter. I don't know about the lighter thing. Like, let's darken it. Why not? Okay, I mean that's decent. But what if what if my client is the artist formerly and now once again known as Prince, and we want to go a little psychedelic, right? So yeah, exactly. All aboard. So instead, let's spin, which means that we take this in color space and we spin it around the hue wheel so that it actually shifts chroma. So I can say, 10% is not actually that much. Let's spin it like 90%. So I'm going to go for the 90% around the color wheel. Oh yeah, now we're getting like a little purple action. I like that. That's fun. Yeah, seriously, right? Another thing that we can do with these is there's a lot of cases where I may want to express, because my designer works in a different color space, may want to express colors in hue, saturation, and lightness, HSL. Well, your browser support for HSL is not great, right? But if I generate this in less, I can run this function and I can tell it, and to be honest, I do not, you're going to have to forgive me, I don't remember anything about HSL, so I'm just winging it at this point, but let's go with this. Yeah, oh, hey, it worked, cool. I can specify it like this, and less behind the scenes will actually render out a standard hex color form. So it'll work in all browsers, but I can work in the color space as a designer that I find comfortable, which is pretty great. What's another thing that I might want to do? So I don't know if you guys saw up here at the top, I've got this guy. I love this style so much. This, and there's a address up here at the top. You should just look for Paul Irish box sizing. He's a Chrome developer advocate, and he's awesome. And he basically talks about this is now supported in Internet Explorer 8 up. And what it does is it changes the way that boxes are measured. Normally when you set the width of an element, the actual size of that element is the width plus the padding, right? And that really stinks because it means that any time that you want to figure out the width of something, you have to take the padding into account. Now, one way is we could just and kind of keep that in mind, but it just kind of drives me nuts. So border box is really great because it means that when I talk about width, I'm talking about from border to border, and then the browser subtracts the padding the way that it's supposed to, the way that Internet Explorer got it right, and the W3C decided that they hate us and they ruined it. But let's say that I don't have that. Let's say that I'm working on a grid website and I have to support Internet Explorer 7, and so I cannot use border box, right? My best friend has been taken from me. Moment of silence, please. Okay. Oh, if you just search for his name, you're going to find it. It's this like WordPress link. Yeah, for the win. Okay. I'll pull that out actually so you guys can see. I'm not cruel. So one of the things that I might want to do is, so if I'm defining like a responsive grid and I have border box on, then normally what I'm going to do is I'm going to say like, okay, so a one column in my grid is a width of 8.3%, right? Because that's 1/12. I'm on a 12 column grid. One of the things that less actually gives me is it does give me math. So I can actually say 100 divided by 12. And yeah, percent by 12%, and it'll figure that out in the format that I want, right? So that's already pretty great. It actually also gives me a percentage. So I could just say percentage 1 divided by 12, and then it'll work that out. So that's pretty great. But if I'm in border box, I don't have that. How many of you have actually read Ethan Marcotte's original responsive design book? 2 of you. Okay, that's fine. You should check it out. It's great. It's from A List Apart. It's a fantastic book. Mike Sinculo will run you an illegal photocopy, I'm pretty sure. Because he's a fan. Mike, if you're listening, I did not say that. There's horrible crosstalk on this mic. I don't know what's going on. So in Marcotte's original version of this, you had to keep your gutters for your columns. You had to figure those into the width because you were going to get padding, right? So we might have a case where, at the very least, I can say that my padding, let's call my gutter padding, let's say that that's 4px. Well, so one of the things I can do now is I can say minus gutter times 2. And so if I'm not working with border box, I can set up my grid classes so that instead of just writing these percentages in there and then I have to add a comment that explains my math, I can write it in a way that looks more like code, that's maintainable and that's expressive about why did I write those numbers? Why is that a correct equation to the right of my percentage? And I can set up a responsive grid class. So with functions and these kinds of just simple mathematical operations that Les gives us, we also have a really powerful tool for reaching back. This isn't just for like new browsers, and I want to use the new hotness with my box shadow and my hip border box. But I can also write for old browsers this way, and I can get much better support, in part because not only can I do this, but if I have like these kind of crappy places where I have to vendor prefix, or if I have to have workarounds, one of the things that I can do, I saw this trick today. There were these, I saw these guys, and they were doing tricks with checkboxes. And Internet Explorer 8 doesn't support the checked pseudo selector. So what they were doing is whenever they would have to do anything that they wanted to hide from Internet Explorer 8, they would say not IE8 because it doesn't understand not either. So they could write this ID doesn't exist. But since Internet Explorer doesn't understand it, it throws the whole rule out. So they're able to sneak that past, right? But then they have to preface all of these things with not IE8. Well, I don't have to do that because I'm in less. So I can say if I'm not in IE8, then when I'm dealing with an input that's checked, I want to do something to it. I can have, well, let's make sure that they are type equals checkbox first. So I can hide my kind of shims, and then I can move this to a separate file, and I can forget about it. I can be like, oh, all of that stuff that I did for IE8, it is out of sight, it is out of mind, I never have to touch it, I never have to worry that an intern is going to come in and do something to it by mistake. I put it there, it works, and I just forget that it exists. It's the best of all possible worlds. It really, really is. I love being able to do that. All right, so we've been building all this stuff live, and that's really, really exciting. But one of the things, obviously, that I really want to be able to do is I need to be able to deploy this. And to deploy it, I need a solid single CSS file, because one file will download faster because it's fewer requests, and one file will be less stress on my server. I can put it up on a CDN. I can minify it, right? I can go through all these different steps. So one of the things that we have, and I'm going to pop open a command window here, is less also comes. What you guys will want to do is you can actually compile these at the command line. And less has a bunch of tools. Like if we go to the less website, there is, in addition to all this stuff, there's the Try It Now link, and you can go to a live preview. Down here at the bottom of this page, there should be a bunch of tools somewhere. Hang on. Let me find it. Tools. Here we go, client-side usage, and then if we go to watch mode, debugging server-side usage, there are some tools that I can run. So there's like in Windows, I can go and I can get a couple of third-party tools that will run them. But the way you guys are going to want to do this, I guarantee, because this is a stepping stone. Less is a stepping stone to this whole workflow of I'm working with automated processes that are awesome instead of working with old-style CSS that drives me crazy in Notepad, right? So you're going to want to go and you're going to want to get yourself a copy of Node.js. It's on Mac, it's on Windows, it's on Linux. It is awesome. It is basically like Python or Ruby, but it's JavaScript, and it runs on your command line. The great thing about Node is there is, at this point, a whole bunch of people like me who grew up, and the programming language that we are most familiar with is JavaScript, and that's what we want to write tools in. So a lot of these tools that are being written, like less is being written in the browser, and then people say, yeah, but I want to be able to output a CSS file. So they write something in Node, and what Node will do is it will install a package manager that will let you go out and get packages automatically for your system. So once you have Node installed, you can just type, let me see if I can zoom this up a little bit so y'all can see, because that's really small. Properties, font, let's go with the 12 by 16. Unable to mod. There we go. Nice. Okay. All right. So the command for that is npm node package manager, and I would type install less, and I'm going to include the G flag, which says global, because I want to be able to run less from anywhere. Normally it will install modules in your project folder of wherever you are now, so that if you have something that's only for one site, you can kind of silo that off. It doesn't have to pollute other things, or if it has a special version that it needs upgrades, don't mess with it. But I want to install less global. And so when I type that, it'll go to the internet, it'll check the registry, find the less package, and install it for me, and any of the dependent packages that it needs. So now, when I go to my desktop, and I go to my less directory, and I look at what I've got, so here's my files, I can say, okay, I would like to run less on demo.less. And what it spits out is the less file. So I can pipe that to my output. I can say pipe that into demo.css. And now demo.css contains my rendered production-ready output. That's the one CSS file. Now on production, I don't have to include this JavaScript on my page. I don't have to worry about it slowing down my visitors. I can leverage all that power and then still end up with one file that my visitors can include, that can be cached, that I can include on my website that is ready to go, right? So, I mean, that's all there is to it, right? It's really easy. Install Node, install less, type less and the file name that you want, and pipe it to a file, and you're all set. I cannot recommend this enough. First, Tanya, and then me.
So, when I've been rolling out CSS, I've been just linking to any given page only the CSS files that it needs. Should I instead just put all the CSS files for the entire site in one and then link it separately?
So Steve, do you know who Steve Souders is? So for the benefit of people who are listening on YouTube, she was asking about whether or not you should include only the CSS that's required for any given page in multiple files, or whether you should have one file that is for the whole site but may include things that aren't on a given page. Steve Souders is the guy, he works at Yahoo just on web performance, and he's got a great blog where he talks about this kind of thing. And essentially, up to a certain size, which tends to, it has to be pretty large, you are better off using one file for your whole site rather than using many files, because it takes long enough for the browser to negotiate a new session and get that next file. It could have downloaded the rest of the first file in that time. So usually it fits within a couple of TCP frames. It's much better for you to actually just request one file that's compiled like this. But if you're worried about it, you can compile, you could compile multiple CSS out of less with multiple seed files that basically just do the imports. You could even build one for each page and just have different seeds that import whatever files are required for that page. It's up to you. Like, this is a really flexible workflow. Yeah, you had a question.
I noticed that when you typed it, it's almost like a double size.
It has doubled in size. Let's take a look, actually.
Like size-wise.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm looking at. So actually, add less. Oh, it's because when I piped it, pipe is not what I wanted to do. Less demo.css or demo.less demo.css. Okay, and then let's look. That still should have worked. Sorry. Oh, I'm actually, sorry. I've got the command wrong. I'm running the less command instead of running less C, which is less compiler. It's been a while since I actually had to do this. This is all automated for me at work, and so I'm totally flaking on it. There we go. So demo.less with less C instead of with less. Let's pipe that into demo.css. There we go. It's a little bit bigger now. Let's go ahead and open that up in Sublime. It's going to be a little bit bigger because it's going to go through and pull those things out that we were able to not repeat, and they have to be repeated now. So like all of those different tabs things, right? It is going to expand into something bigger, but it shouldn't be twice as big. I apologize for that. No, it's not going to be double. That's my mistake. So, okay, good catch though. Excellent. I was wondering why it hadn't changed. I was like, man, that's embarrassing. Okay. So one of the other things that you guys may want to look at, there's a lot of really cool tools for Node, and less is just one of them. One of the ones that I really like personally, for a long time I actually didn't use less in watch mode because I was working on a site that was in PHP. Less wouldn't necessarily know when those files had changed because I needed to run a build system on the back end. one of the things that I really like, in addition to less, there's a thing called Grunt, gruntjs.com. And what Grunt does is Grunt lets you set up basically scripts like, for those of you who have built software, there's like a make command that you can run. Yeah. Grunt is that, but for web pages. It lets you automate a build process. And one of the things that I really like is if you have Grunt installed, there's a plugin for it called Grunt Watch. And you say Grunt Watch, and then it keeps an eye on all the files in your directory. And when they change, it runs whatever script, which in my case would be compile my CSS for me. So I could be working just in my less files. I would save, and it would update the CSS file automatically. I don't have to go to the command line. It keeps an eye on that for me. And then when I refresh in my browser or when I check into source control later, I'm not going to run into a case where I've forgotten to update that and it didn't check in properly. It'll always be up to date because Grunt will keep an eye on it for me. And there's lots of cool stuff that you can do with Grunt, actually. It's a phenomenally powerful tool. I was using it at work to build emails. I had set up a quick JavaScript templating system because I had to write these emails and they had to be in 5 different languages and it was going to drive me crazy. I don't know how many people have written HTML emails, but it's basically the worst thing ever. So I set up a JSON file that had all of my content in it and then told Grunt to watch those files and when my content changed to render out 5 versions of the email. And then I could just keep them open in Internet Explorer where I could test for the atrocity that is Outlook viewing email. And I could just I could have it watch that directory too, instant reload, and I would see in real time, oh, in Internet Explorer it really doesn't like this. Here's my, God help me, table-based layout to work in email. I can make sure that that works. You have no idea how long it's been since I did a table layout. It was brutal. So glad I'm not doing that anymore. So all of these are really powerful tools. Less will get you started. Like if you just start with any of this stuff, starting with less and installing nodes so that you can start doing the compilation, think of this as kind of like your gateway process. Don't feel like you have to jump into it all at once. It's useful just in little doses, even just for the live reload. Less is really useful. But as you get more and more into it, this is going to start getting you guys into a really tool-oriented workflow, which to me is the real development of the last 5 years of web development, has been that we now have these kinds of tools to make our lives easier. And there you go. Less dynamic style sheet language. Does anyone have any questions? Thank you. It's not really necessary. Yeah.
What's the, when looking at CSS compilers, there's SAS seems to be the big one. What's the relationship between these two?
Okay, so that's a good question. So in addition to less, there's also SAS. And SAS is, in addition to being, oh Lord, SAS, CSS. So SAS was originally invented by Ruby developers. And it's basically the same thing. It gives you a little bit more, like you can actually write loops in SAS. You get a little bit more control. It becomes a little bit more of a programming language. A lot of people really like SAS, and there's support for it. From my point of view, they're mostly interchangeable. The syntax tends to be mostly the same, or the features are the same. You just pick one. Like, whatever one you pick, it's going to be so much better than old-style CSS that I don't care. You know, like, that's the thing. I don't care what your tools are, because they're going to be better than writing all my CSS by hand. The one thing that I will say, so SAS started out, because it is a Ruby invention, Ruby developers have, like, Ruby causes this kind of brain damage, where all Ruby developers, they want everything to look like Ruby. And that means that they hate parentheses and they hate curly braces. So there are actually 2 SAS syntaxes. There's this one, which looks a lot like less, right? Like nested selectors and all this good stuff. And then there's this one where they basically get rid of all the brackets because it scares them. And it's up to you. Some people really like that. There's a templating language that goes with this called Haml, where you're writing HTML, but you don't write any of the braces. I think it's crazy. But if it works for you, that's the other great thing about all these tools, right? Is you have plenty of choices for picking these kinds of workflows. And I think, honestly, like, just pick something. I don't care what it is. If you want it to be SAS or less, like, I think they're equivalent. I don't have any problem with one or the other. I kind of prefer less because I think there's a limit to how much logic I want in my style sheets. I don't really want to have to worry about like an infinite loop in my CSS. I think that's a bad idea. But there are times when it would be really useful. Like if I'm writing a grid, in less, I can write functions to make that easier, but I still have to list out all of my grid classes. Whereas in SAS, I could probably write a loop that would let me generate them all in one go and just tell it how many grid classes I want. So, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. And if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. You can always reach me. My website is thomaswilburn.net, so I'm easy to find. Send me an email. I'm happy to help with any questions you might have.